If Sora Shiunin was going to be completely honest, he didn't believe in gods. Of course, that wasn't the kind of thing you said while you were growing up under a religious oligarchy, and he had learned very quickly that the smart plan was to keep your mouth shut on pretty much any and all opinions. Listening, after all, got you the most dirt, and regardless of what the priests wanted to believe, dirt and blackmail was the only way anything got done around here. Sora sat silently in the alcove underneath one of the windows high on the wall. He was tucked behind the small statue that occupied the alcove, but said statue wasn't thick enough to take up the whole space. Someday Sora would be too big to fit in here, but he would take advantage of it while he could. No one ever thought to look up, after all. No one except Edo, at least. That wasn't important for now, though, so Sora turned his attention to the chaos below. It was far more lively in the inner temple than it normally was. That was to be expected, what with the Emperor missing and all. That was a big deal. Sora's tongue flicked over his dry lips as he peered past the statue and looked over the chaos, trying to count priests and guess about how many inner and outer priests were coming and going. The outer priests all seemed a lot more panicked than the inner ones, and there were a lot more of them bustling back and forth with arms full of books and scrolls or more demon weapons. An order had gone out to reduce use of the weapons and bracers as much as possible, as until His Majesty was returned they couldn't reinfuse the items with his blessing. Sora twisted his own bracer around his wrist. He had only one, and it was a thin thing, barely a bracelet. A few grooves were carved into the black metal. When activated, those runes would glow a dull red, like blood was filling them up, and eventually, once the power bled out of it, they'd turn to a silvery gray. Sora had never had to use his, though. It was just a basic protection bracer given to acolytes. It would send out a pulse of energy that would temporarily knock out anyone without a bracer within a 100-foot radius. If for some reason he found himself in trouble, like from hecklers and heathens as Edo always called them, it would give him a few moments of reprieve to escape. Not that Sora was even allowed outside the temple until he was either initiated or phased out. One of the lovely perks of being a staircase acolyte, an orphan left on the steps of the temple by parents that didn't want him. He twisted the bracer around his wrist again, considering it. How did it work, anyway? The inner priest said that the Emperor performed a special ceremony to infuse the offered blades with his power. Was that his blessing? Sora wasn't convinced he was really a god. Gods didn't grow up normally like human beings, and Sora had seen the Emperor grow up just like he had. No, he was positive the Emperor was just an extraordinarily powerful blessed soul, like Sora. Legend said the most powerful blessings could be transferred to objects so that other people could use them, and heroes had given parts of their power as gifts to their friends and allies. Of course, the real problem became this. If the Emperor really was just a blessed child, why did everyone think he was a god? Nobody thinks I'm a god, he thought, feeling briefly miffed about it. I'm almost as powerful as he is. Either way, it had always seemed pretty suspicious to Sora that no one outside the very inner circle of inner priests could watch the ceremony that infused the weapons. Everyone could come and watch priest initiations, even common people, so why the secrecy? Well, with all the commotion, Sora thought this might be the best time to find out. It would be much easier to sneak around. Sora planned to wait for a lull before he climbed out of the alcove, but he didn't end up getting the chance because the far doors opened and Edo swept through. He looked a little strained, as usual in a crowd. Sensing emotions was probably a pain in the ass. Sora was glad he didn't have that blessing. Judging by the way Edo was looking around, too, he was probably looking for Sora. Sora should have known that was coming after leaving that note for him. He probably should have waited to tell Edo what he was up to, because Edo would want answers now, and Sora didn't have any yet. Sora pressed himself into the alcove, hoping the statue and the shadows would hide him. No such luck. Edo stopped right underneath the alcove, raising an eyebrow as he looked up towards it. "Sora," he said, "don't you have more important things to be doing than spying?" Sora groaned, rolling his eyes. Jig was up. "Do I?" he said, peeking out from the alcove. Edo huffed once. "Could you have picked a more dangerous place to climb up into? What if you fell?" "I'd catch myself." Edo sighed. He glanced at the priests running back and forth in the hallway. A few of them paused to see what was going on, but most of them saw Sora and Edo and kept walking. High Priest Phoenix scolding his apprentice was normal enough sight, although Sora knew some of them would start to whisper again as soon as they got out of earshot. Why did the high priest of the outer circle make such a poor choice in his first apprentice? The boy is a menace. Could you come down here? It's difficult to talk to you with my neck craned like this. Do I have to? Edo narrowed his eyes briefly, and Sora knew that yes, he had to. This was probably about his note. He really should have waited to tell Edo that he was going to investigate. Sora wriggled himself free of the alcove and swung his legs around, gripping the carvings on the wall's pillar to start shimmying down. He could have easily floated down using this blessing, but climbing was far more fun, and it took longer, making Edo wait. Sora hopped lightly to the floor and turned to face Edo. He didn't bother fixing his now rumpled, dusty robes, but Edo did, frowning as he reached down to smooth out the folds. Might I have a word with you at my study, he said. I don't really have a choice, so yeah. Edo frowned again, and Sora could almost hear the I'm your mentor, not your keeper bit. For once, Edo didn't say it, though, and Sora thought it was probably because he really wanted to hear what Sora had to say and didn't want Sora to say no. He beckoned at him, and Sora sighed. He followed after Edo down the hall and out the doors. They went through the creepy, dead forest-looking courtyard with its twisted branches and dead rocks everywhere, out to the outer wall, where the outer temple was built into it. Edo opened the door with a wave of his demon bracer and beckoned Sora to go in ahead of him. The outer temple wasn't too much different from the inner temple, if a little more cramped. The interior decorating was the same morbid shades of red and black, and carvings of twisted faces of death, though. Sora followed Edo down the thin hallways, ducking around yet more rustling priests until they reached Edo's study. Edo unlocked this door, too, and let Sora in. Edo's study was barely an office. It had maybe enough space to hold 10 people if you squished them in really tightly. There was a single thin window to let light trickle in, but only when the sun was setting because of the way it was facing. Edo's cot was folded up in the corner. The room itself was incredibly empty, with the only other furniture being a pair of thin wicker chairs, a battered old desk with scrolls and quills, and one small bookshelf with only a few thick tomes. The rest of the shelf space filled with small religious items, like the iconic tiny statue of a dead black tree, or a few crests carved with religious symbols. Sometimes, Sora wondered how Edo could live like this. This was his entire space. Sora had to sleep with other acolytes in a cramped room full of bunk beds, of course, but Edo was the high priest of the outer circle. Shouldn't he get a better room? You know, Rajay's room is way nicer than yours, he said. Why is that? That's High Priest Rajay, Sora, and you shouldn't be sneaking around in other priests' rooms, especially High Priest's rooms. Sora just pressed his lips together. It was true, though. Sora had sneaked into a few rooms while they were empty, and Rajay's room was actually bigger than even the Emperor's room. It always seemed a little suspicious to Sora. Then again, he couldn't exactly admit that he'd been in the Emperor's room, not unless he wanted to be executed for blasphemy. You don't like him either, said Sora, as Edo walked around his desk to sit at one of the two chairs. I don't need to be able to feel emotions like you to tell. Edo's lips pressed together. My personal opinion of High Priest Rajay is of little concern, he said. We don't have to like each other. Our goals and our devotion to our god are the same. Are they? Sora didn't sit down in the other chair, even though he could tell Edo was waiting for him to. Sitting down meant he was on Edo's terms, and he wasn't in the mood for that today. Edo steepled his fingers together and waited for just a few breaths. When Sora didn't move or elaborate, he sighed, leaning back in his chair with his eyes closing. You're a smart boy, Sora, he said, but you can't let your emotions cloud your judgment. Your feelings towards Rajay don't have a place in our order. We have to work together to... I'm telling you he's up to something. I don't think you should trust him. Edo's eyes opened, and for a moment he frowned at Sora. Then he sighed again and moved up to lean his elbows on the desk, eyes fixed on Sora. You know why I chose you to be my personal apprentice, right? Sora sighed. This again. You're smart, Sora. You're quick, and you don't take anything at face value. You question everything you see and look for your own answers instead of taking what others give you. It's the mark of potential, and I see a lot of it in you. Yes, Dad, Sora quipped. If Edo had been anyone else in the Order, he probably would have had Sora beaten for that. But Edo wasn't anyone else. He just chuckled. Listen, Sora, we need more people like you in the temple. Not people who make up their minds and never change them, but people who want answers and seek them. And what if the answer I find is that I still don't believe in God? That usually got him to end a conversation, as Edo was most disappointed with his apprentice's lack of faith. Usually it would get him sent to the sanctuary to meditate for a few hours, and he could sneak away and get back to whatever he wanted to be doing. Today, though, Edo just shook his head. Then you can age out of the temple and leave when you're 18, but I don't think that's what you'll choose. You've stayed for as long as you have already. I just don't think he's a god, Sora thought. He doesn't look like a god. Sora shrugged. Where else am I going to get free food? He said. Edo just smiled wryly. He tugged at the cord around his neck, pulling the crest out from under his robes. It was the mark of his status as the high priest of the outer circle, a thin, flat disc that had the runes of the Emperor's blessing etched on its silver front. He played with it for a moment, just staring at the way the light flickered off of it. All right, he said, looking up. I'll bite, Sora. What makes you think I shouldn't trust High Priest Roger? Besides the fact that he's a power-hungry weirdo, Sora said. Edo's eye twitched, and Sora knew he was reaching the limit of how much sass he could give out today. I'm thinking about the demon weapons again. I want to know how they're made. We forged them here in the outer sanctuary forges, with the proper rune etchings to perform their intended tasks, Edo said. Then the Emperor infuses them with power over a brief period for us to use. But how does he do it? Sorry, how does His Grace do it exactly? He corrected himself when Edo's eye twitched again. He wanted Edo to listen, so he had to play by the rules for now. He blesses them, Edo said. Sora clenched his jaw. With all due respect, I don't think that's a good enough answer, he said. Why is it so secretive? Does this have to do with why you mistrust High Priest Roger? His servant went missing the other day. I haven't seen him anywhere. And Roger's been disappearing for hours at a time. Not even his closest attendants know where he is during that time. Doesn't that seem weird? The Emperor is gone and he's been disappearing off by himself. I'm sure he has things he must attend to as well, Edo said. And that's High Priest Roger, Sora. Sora ignored him. He had gotten a little twitch of uncertainty in Edo's eyes, and he thought he could push it a little further. I went into the Emperor's room yesterday, he said. This was a gamble. Admitting to trespassing of that magnitude could get him executed. He kept talking before Edo could say anything, talking over him. It was hard to tell, but there's dried blood all over the floor, and I found this on the table. He dug in his pocket, pulling out the little jar of ashes. It was half a lie. It hadn't been on the table. It had been in one of the drawers he had ruffled through, but he was risking a lot just admitting he'd been in the Emperor's room at all. The idea of telling Edo that he'd been snooping through all the drawers, too, was almost certainly too dangerous. Edo frowned at the jar, clearly surprised enough to forget that he was about to lecture Sora for his sin of trespassing in the Emperor's rooms. He picked it up, turning it around against the light. He popped off the lid and dipped a finger into it to look at the dust on his finger. Ashes, he said. Those are for scarification. You know, right? I'm afraid I'm not following. Sora winced. He was admitting to a lot of shit right now, but he had to make sure Edo knew. With all this commotion and chaos. Sora's mind drew back for a moment, to a day when the sun was actually shining for once in this dark-ass country. When he'd pulled himself up into a tree to avoid the other staircase kids who'd been throwing rocks at him. When Edo had stopped underneath the tree and looked up. The only person who had ever looked up. What are you doing up there? Getting closer to God, Sora had said, sarcastic. That would have gotten him a beating from the priests in charge of the staircase kids. Edo had only laughed. He wasn't like the other priest. He was better than they were. He thought to another memory. A whispered breath in the darkness of a hallway he wasn't supposed to be in. A hiss through the lips of someone that might have been Roger. He couldn't tell in the dark. The night that Edo had been initiated as the high priest of the outer circle. Someone had whispered, I'll find a way to have him removed permanently. Sora didn't believe in God, but he believed in Edo. And hell if he was going to let anyone take the only person that had shown him any modicum of kindness. He came back to the room, where Edo was waiting patiently for an answer. Far more patiently than he should have been waiting after hearing his apprentice had been snooping in his god's rooms. I've seen them doing it in alleys, Sora said. When I'm up in trees looking over the wall, they rub those ashes into people's cuts to make them last longer, like tattoos. I've seen them doing it in the prison, too, to make blood runes scar. Edo frowned. Clearly he had never heard of such a practice. But why would this be in the Emperor's room? He said. I don't know, Sora said. Why would anyone need to scar the Emperor? No one would. To even touch him is a sin, Edo said. His voice was so full of fervor and confidence in this that Sora felt his stomach twist. You don't belong in a world like this, he thought, staring at Edo with his wide, open face full of belief and faith. It's too cutthroat for someone like you. I'm honestly amazed you're still alive. I'm just telling you what I'm finding, Sora said, shoving his hands into his pockets. Something feels wrong. Really wrong. And I'm getting nervous. It took a lot to admit that, but it was true. In all this chaos, it would make it much easier for someone to have Edo assassinated and blame it on a terrorist attack. Edo could disappear, and Sora would be all alone again. He didn't believe in miracles either, but it had been one hell of a coincidence that he'd managed to end up with Edo instead of someone else. And if Rajay had his way, Sora was certain that he would take all that away from him. Edo sighed. He set the jar back onto the table. Sora, I know that everything is a little nerve-wracking right now, he said, but that is no reason to let your suspicions overtake you. I thought you said I was good at asking questions. That's what I'm trying to do. Sora. Edo's voice actually cracked a bit, and Sora shut up. He looked disappointed. Sora's stomach twisted. Listen to me, he said. I'm going to overlook that you were where you absolutely weren't supposed to be, but just this once. I cannot keep covering for you when you do things like this, Sora, and I cannot condone it either. This was one of those shut up, Sora moments, so Sora kept his mouth shut. We have to work together in times like this, Sora. We're all frightened, but I need you focused on what needs to be done right now. Can you promise me that? No, Sora thought. Fine, he said, keeping his eyes on the floor. Edo blew out once through his lips. Sora could tell that Edo was thinking he had agreed too easily. He probably would have pressed more, but then the door pounded with the sound of someone knocking. High Priest Phoenix, there's been another skirmish near the eastern gate. Edo swore, shooting to his feet. He bolted around his desk, pausing only long enough to grip Sora's shoulders. Please, Sora, I need you with the enchanters, he said. Tell them I sent you, do what you can to help them locate the Emperor. Report back to me if they return by sunset. Yes, sir, Sora said, not meeting his eyes. It was a testament to the emergency they were in that Edo didn't respond to Sora's petulant, rebellious emotions. He just squeezed Sora's shoulders, released him, and ran out the door. For a few moments, Sora only stood there, staring at the tiny, austere room. It really wasn't big enough for Edo. He did all the goddamn work around here practically by himself. Sora's fists curled up. Fine. He'd planned on waiting a few days to find the best route, but he would do it right now. He'd find his way into the basement. He knew it had to exist. He explored every corner of the temple as soon as he'd been old enough to sneak and hide, using his blessing to distract patrols or get into places that he shouldn't be able to get to. There were doors that he couldn't open with his own bracer, doors that were always closed no matter what time he went. Except during the week of the new moon, when the inner temple was so tightly closed up that even he couldn't get in. Something was happening in there. He knew it. He'd find proof that Rajay was planning shit, and he'd show Edo. It was surprisingly easy to sneak around when no one was expecting you. Of course, it also helped that Sora could suspend himself in midair and clamber along the ceiling. No one ever looks up. Sora did not believe in gods or miracles, but he did believe in blessings. Who knew where they came from, but he knew he had one of the most powerful ones the priest had seen, and he was damn proud of it. Telekinesis, Edo had called it when he saw Sora use it for the first time. More specifically, they'd found through testing, it was his ability to manipulate the gravity of objects, just quickly enough that he could cause items to be drawn towards other people at very fast speeds, like knives, or scissors. Like that one time when one of the asshole kids in his bunk room had tried to smother him in his sleep with a pillow. He had trouble with moving other people, but he could move himself easily enough, changing his gravity to move upwards or sideways instead so that he could walk along walls and ceilings. He went to the throne room. It was empty now that the council meeting was over, and Sora was sure that Rajay had disappeared somewhere in here. One distracted priest later, and Wunlock's gravity convinced to go the opposite direction, and he was through. He closed and locked the throne room door behind him, then turned towards the dark, cavernous room. It was almost night already, and the windows were never very big in here to begin with. Without any torches, the room looked like a giant maw with pillar teeth about to swallow him whole. He bit back the nerves and made his way to the back of the room. There was only one place that a secret door could be hiding in this room, and that was behind the throne, where no self-respecting servant of the Emperor would ever dare go. He darted across the room and up the stairs, trying to ignore the demonic looming of the creepy throne as he walked behind it into the shadows beneath. It was too dark to see, so Sora had to wait a few moments for his eyes to adjust. He felt forward carefully. What was back here in the alcove behind the throne? His fingers came across the silver-black piping that made up the fancy backdrop, then to the heavy curtains that hung right behind the throne. There was space back here. Sora pushed through, squinting through the dark. He felt ahead into the cool space and metal. He felt metal and a latch. A door. Sora tried to use his blessing to lift the latch. Nothing. It was warded against blessings. He should have known. He ran his tongue over his lips. How badly did he want to get in here? He could probably change the gravity of the throne, make it fall, then cause it to bludgeon the door open. But then he wouldn't be secret anymore. So instead, he could... Was that the sound of someone opening the latch? Sora threw his gravity to the wall on his right, landing lightly on it as though it were the floor, and running towards the ceiling. He crouched there, waiting as he saw the door swing open. It was Roger. Sora bit his tongue as the man stormed out of the room. Even in the dark, Sora could see his mussed-up hair, his ground teeth. It took Sora only a moment to realize that this was his only chance to get inside. He felt out the throne and altered its gravity. Just enough to make it squeak. Then he released it back to where it was supposed to be. It made Roger hesitate, his eyes glinting toward the sound. Sora changed his gravity again, sliding down the wall until he was standing above the door. He crawled through it from the top, inches from Roger's head, and let himself plaster to the wall inside. Roger huffed, then closed the door behind Sora, leaving him in the dark. Sora waited. He counted the seconds until he'd counted off 2 minutes. Only then did he let himself slip down to the floor, landing lightly on steps. He was on stairs. He ran his tongue over his lips. He got out of this one of 2 ways. 1, he was caught, and Edo would be forced to have him punished for trespassing. Or 2, he found undeniable proof that Roger couldn't be trusted. He felt his way down the stairs as slowly as he could. After a few minutes, light appeared at the bottom, flickering torchlight that slowly helped his eyes acclimate. He reached the bottom of the stairs. This place looked like a prison, he thought. Cold, dark stone walls, a damp taste to the air. There were torches, but they were very sparse. There was one here at the bottom of the stairs, and then one at the far ends of the hallway on either side of Sora. He bit his lip. Which way? He decided on left. He had only made it a few feet down the featureless hallway before it split off to his left again, another torch at the end of that one. He took the fork, one hand on the wall to keep himself grounded in the patches of darkness. What was this place even for? It wasn't for storage, that was for sure. There weren't any doors or anything either, so what were the hallways for? There was another door at the end of this hallway. This one reacted when he pushed on it with his blessing, and he slipped through. He felt a cold seep into his chest when he saw what lay before him. The chamber was huge and circular. A raised dais ran along the outside, but in the lowered center, grooves were carved into the ground, leading to 4 pools at the end of each end of the compass. And in the very center, there was an altar with chains affixed to each corner. Dread crawling through Sora's stomach and drying out his throat, he stepped gingerly into the lowered space, avoiding the deep grooves. He paused to peek into them. He shivered. Was that dried blood? That was a lot of blood. Had it filled up every single one of these grooves? The dry line reached pretty far. Someone who lost that much blood would have been dead. Were they sacrificing people down here? Sora made his way to the altar. It was the same here. The entire table was stained with blood stains. The chains were bloody too, but mostly on the inside, implying that whoever had been chained here had rubbed so badly against the chains that they bled into them. Sora felt sick. What was this? Blood sacrifice? There weren't any clues in here, so Sora gratefully stepped back from the altar and hurried to the door he'd seen on the other side. Once through that door, 3 paths opened to him, one to each side and one in front. He hesitated, looking carefully at each one. There seemed to be some doors set into the walls of these halls, so was there something inside any of them? He checked the one in front of him first. He walked slowly, checking every door. None of them were blessing warded or even locked, so he could peek through. They were all the same on the left, though. All of them were prison cells. Bare, tiny boxes with just a bench and chains. He checked the ones on the right, but they were stranger. Some of them were simply larger cells, but one was a bare room with just a bunch of cabinets and a big glass window on the other end. When Sora looked through, he saw an even bigger cell, like it was some kind of observation room. He bit his lip at the state of the room, though. Huge, wild claw marks rutted the walls, and parts of the rock looked like they'd been burned or even melted, and hardened up again in puddles of stone on the floor. Remains of shredded chains lay inside, and a few bones, too, Sora realized with horror. Were they keeping an animal in here? And where was it now if it wasn't in there? He wanted to bolt, but he made himself check all the cabinets. There were lots of scrolls and pads of notes. He didn't recognize the shorthand on most of them, but he choked at the sight of a diagram on the one he'd pulled out. This was a picture of the Emperor, only he wasn't in his robes, and there were runes drawn all over his body. The Emperor had blood runes? That wasn't right. No one was supposed to touch the Emperor. Even brushing against his hand by accident could be grounds for execution. So why were there plans here for experimental runes? Sora hadn't even seen most of these before. They looked like some legitimately nasty stuff. He ripped the page out and the 3 after it, folded them up and shoved them into his pocket. Edo might know what they meant, even if it meant getting into trouble. He left that room behind and continued on. He started skipping a few of the doors because they all looked exactly the same as the prison cells before. He stopped at one where the door was sealed shut. That was weird. Why was this the only one that was closed? He put his hand to the metal, and then shivered. Did he hear someone crying on the other side of this door? There was someone in prison down here. Heart thumping in his chest, Sora attacked the lock with his blessing. It simply crumpled. He had made it experience too much gravity in his haste, and he pushed the door open. He almost threw up. There was someone in here, and it was a wonder he wasn't dead. It actually took Sora a second to realize that it was Rajay's missing servant boy. Sora had never spoken to him, but Dennis was always around Rajay up till recently. So this was where he turned up. The boy lay crumpled on the floor, hands chained together. His shirt was ripped to shreds, his back sliced to ribbons by a whip. He trembled and twitched strangely, and there were burn marks all over his arms. His hair was burnt at some of the edges, too, and Sora didn't want to know how that had happened. He darted forward, dropping to his knees, hands hovering awkwardly over Dennis. Dennis flinched, his whole body convulsing at the motion. "I'm sorry," he gasped, his eyes wide and blurry. Hey, it's okay, it's not whoever you think it is," Sora said. "Shh, hey, don't move, okay?" Dennis blinked blearily at him for a second, mouth flapping open and closed. "Yuya," he mumbled, and then, "No, I can't be hallucinating again. Yuya got away." "Yuya?" Sora said, just desperate to keep Dennis talking. How is he still alive? What had Rajay been doing to him? Who is Yuya? "He got away," Dennis mumbled. Oh God, he was barely coherent. "Got far away. Reese can't touch him anymore. Can't bleed him anymore." Sora felt himself blanching, the blood all over the altar. His mind worked quickly, more quickly than he wanted it to, and he covered his mouth with both hands to repress the desire to vomit. "Are you talking about the Emperor?" he whispered, not wanting to believe what he was hearing. "Are you saying the Emperor ran away?" Dennis's eyes rolled back into his head briefly, and Sora choked, thinking he was dead. I don't know where he went," Dennis said, his voice broken and scratchy. "Don't know. I just made the distraction. Can't tell you what I don't know." No, it couldn't be possible. The explosion at the festival, Roger torturing his own servant, the Emperor missing. The Emperor ran away, Sora thought, horrified. What would make him? Why would he run away? You're a smart boy, Sora, Edo had said. Too smart for my own good, Sora thought, feeling like he was going to choke. He had to get Dennis out of there, and he had to tell Edo that. He had to tell him the truth. Dennis knew the truth. He was right next to Roger and the Emperor all the time. He knew the truth. This was the proof Sora needed. But Dennis was on death's doorstep, and Sora didn't know what to do. I can't take him to Edo right away, he thought. It's not safe in the temple for him. Not now. Roger could find a way to strong-arm Edo into handing him back over. Could make up an excuse about why he tortured him that has nothing to do with the Emperor. Sora sucked in a breath. I have to take him to the rebellion.